welcome to Big Tent USA. My name is Melissa Kane, and I'm the vice chair of Big Tent USA, and I am thrilled to be welcoming Wendy Weiser and Lauren Groh-Wargo back to Big Tent today for the first in a series of events that will be focused on protecting the 2026 election. Next month, on March 10th, we have Joyce Vance and Mark Elias joining us. There'll be more info about that in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. Big Tent USA is steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower our community with facts and calls to action so we can all become stronger, more effective advocates for our country. This week, we need to hammer Congress to vote against the Save America Act, which would require proof of citizenship to vote and put up barriers to voting. Five calls makes it very easy to make your voice heard. So we'll put a link in the chat and you know what to do. All right, let's get started. Lauren Groh-Wargo is a political and civic engagement strategist, executive, and advocate for economic and voting rights. She partnered with Hi, Lauren. She partnered with Stacey Abrams in 2012 to build democratic and progressive infrastructure in Georgia. And in response to 2018 voter suppression, she founded and serves as CEO of Fair Fight Action, which combats suppression and advances voter education. Wendy Weiser is the Vice President for Democracy at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Hi, Wendy. There she oversees work on voting rights, elections, redistricting, courts, and abuse of power. A constitutional lawyer and democracy expert, she directs research, litigation, policy, advocacy, and public education initiatives, including programs on voting access, judicial reform, and executive power safeguards. Lauren and Wendy, thank you both so much for coming back to Big Tent USA. Really glad to have you here today. So this topic is pretty much the big one. How do we make sure that the 2026 election is free and fair and not tampered with? And right now it's looking like this administration is doing really everything it possibly can to do the opposite, to interfere. The push to nationalize elections, the DOJ's pressure campaign and legal action to obtain complete state voter files, the push to end mail-in ballots and pass the SAVE Act, all point to adding new barriers, and making it harder for Americans to make their voices heard. So with this as the backdrop, I would love to start off by looking at the extraordinary FBI raid of Fulton County, Georgia's election offices last week and the seizure of 2020 voting records. Lauren, you are right there in Georgia. What is the situation on the ground? Why is this so concerning?
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa, and to the Big Tent community. So the fixation on Fulton County in Georgia, I'm sure everybody here remembers and knows about, dates back to 2020, the historic win that happened for Joe Biden, and then we elected two senators. And throughout that period, that runoff period, we saw an extraordinary level of disinformation and voter suppression from the mouths of the now president, Donald Trump, doxing of local elections workers, creating lies about what was actually happening. And folks also remember that there were multiple audits and hand recounts in the entire state of Georgia and Fulton County, proving the result and that Joe Biden did win. And ever since then, Donald Trump has gone to extraordinary lengths to try to reverse that result, calling and trying to strong arm our Secretary of State, filing a whole slew of litigation that was all defeated, and then most insidiously propagating just lies and disinformation and conspiracy theories. But I think what folks have to remember is that we are not just up against a tactic, a strategy. We are up against a large, coordinated architecture to remake our elections in an autocratic model. It was put on hyperdrive through the insurrection by folks like Cleta Mitchell, who was on that phone call with our Secretary of State and Donald Trump, forming the Election Integrity Network. There's many other organizations involved. And what they did was professionalize the voter suppression apparatus to a degree we had never seen before. We've had voter suppression for some time. This is not new. The Brennan Center and others have done unbelievable analysis to show that it is racially targeted. What we've seen since the Georgia win in 2020 and the insurrection is a coordination and professionalization where there's a set of working groups, including looking at all these different issues of machines, of documentary proof of citizenship, of ballots, of hand-marked paper ballots, a whole slew of pieces. And they're moving them through policy, They're moving them through litigation. They're moving them through federal policy and state policy. And they're moving them through an election administrative network where they have their folks placed at this point. For years, they've been putting conspiracy theorists, election deniers on local and state boards of elections. That's what goes into now Fulton. What happened was a set of these election deniers have released a report and they are publicly taking credit for the raid. It's a bunch of rehashed conspiracy theories around the 2020
Right.
elections that has now
Already disproven.
taken this extraordinary action. And Fulton, this is a local issue, but this is a national issue. This is the only county in the country the Trump regime has targeted with litigation to get the voter file and the ballots, and then this next step of a seizure. We know this is about Trump's fixation on Georgia, but it's about the larger national effort to try to change how elections are run and to create a pretense to try to get further federal control over who votes, whose vote gets counted, and how elections are run.
So thank you, Lauren. A number of people in the chat were asking that you turn your volume up. So I'm not sure your volume is down, but you brought us right into the next question perfectly. Wendy, I would love to hear your thoughts on, again, in this larger picture outside of Fulton County, what just happened. Explain how it relates to all of these other things that are happening nationally right now in order to as Lauren said, as part of the professionalization of the suppression voter suppression apparatus.
So what just happened in Fulton County was extraordinary and unprecedented. People need to know this is not normal. Presidents and administrations do not seize election equipment in our and nor do they have any authority to run or control elections. And that's sort of a really important context because part of what this effort is trying to do is to shift our expectations and shift what people think is appropriate, that somehow there is some proper role for the president or for the administration in running elections or in election administration. And I just sort of want to start with that baseline understanding. There is no authority that presidents have over elections and election administration. The Constitution is very clear. It gives that power to regulate elections to the states. It gives Congress the power to pass laws to override that. And the president has no independent role. And so, there's a law enforcement role. It does not include getting the machinery of elections, trying to affect what the election rules are or how people run their elections. There are congressional laws that make it very clear, in addition to the Constitution, that it is state election officials who are responsible for maintaining voting equipment, for maintaining voter rolls, again, not the president. And so I want to put that out there because part of this broad campaign that we are seeing is, and the president, as you alluded to at the beginning, said that we should just nationalize elections or a Republican
Right.
should just take over elections. No political party and no presidency can take over elections in our system and in our Constitution. There is no legal authority to do that. So what happened here? This was a muscle flex, and it has a range of negative consequences. So one is it is sending chills into the spines of many of us who are worried that they are going to try to interfere more aggressively in elections, and in election officials nationwide who are wondering, am I next? Are they going to come and try to interfere in elections? No, they only seized election materials from the 2020 election, but they are trying to lay the foundation and claim that they should be able to do that for ongoing elections. And one of the things that the president has now said on more than one occasion, he is claiming the authority to oversee and control elections and vote counting and tabulation. He said that the states are merely his agents when it comes to vote counting and tabulation. He has said that twice. Again, that is exactly backwards and the opposite of what the Constitution says. But as he's laying the foundation to persuade the public of a different reality. And so what is going on in Georgia is inappropriate. It is intimidating to election officials. It is and it is part of this broader context of the president saying, I get to be in charge. And it is only one of many, many steps that the administration has been taking since the beginning of this year to either seize control of election machinery, to claim the unilateral ability to regulate elections, to threaten and harass election officials and others involved in the election process, or to engage in retribution against them. It has been a pretty relentless campaign, and there's been a real escalation in the last couple of weeks. It was Georgia. It was the letter that the Attorney General Pam Bondi sent in Minnesota, which we can get to later. It's been an escalation in the efforts to try to seize voter rolls across the country, and then this rhetorical escalation, including the floating increasingly the ideas of inappropriate engagement of ICE or troops around elections. So it is an escalation. And I want to also note that all of these other things are also inappropriate and unlawful. So the whole context that people need to know is there is a campaign, but it is not a lawful campaign. The president doesn't have legal authority to do any of this. And so that is the context on which we're all pushing back.
You've both now mentioned that an escalation. It's an escalation and it's an evolution, right, since 2020 of how this administration in particular is figuring out how to attack election administration. And I guess and I want to turn to something that's going to happen in the next few months, which will affect the Voting Rights Act. But I just want to say, I assume you feel that it's important that Americans understand that this is very coordinated. None of this is isolated. And why is that? Is that a pattern? I mean, it seems to be much more coordinated and more sophisticated than last time.
Look, just the same thing we're seeing in voting in elections is what we're seeing to the rest of the federal government and the actions of Trump and his. We don't call it an administration, we call it a regime, because this is not how a normal administration works. So Project 2025 laid out what they were going to do, and they've been doing it. That was the shadow government between his first administration and now the regime that put this together, including some of the voting pieces. And then you have groups like Election Integrity Network and True the Vote and ALEC and others working in this much more coordinated fashion. And I think what we have seen, I call his executive orders angry press releases. The angry press releases of 2025 moved the conversation, and as Wendy said, moved what is acceptable. And they're doing the same thing and have been on elections, but now we are in the midterm year, and they're going to go, we believe they're going to push as far as they can.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about losing Congress in the midterms and then being subject to investigation, though it is about that. It's not just about whether or not the Senate can change hands to the Democrats, though it is about that. This is ultimately about what happens in 2028, and it's also about dispiriting us. Here's the thing people have to get very comfortable with. They're already interfering with the 2026 election by doing what they did in Fulton County. That means anybody who casts a ballot in the future in this country or works on elections in the future in this country now knows that 6 years from now, their records or their work could be subjected to a political, conspiratorial-based raid. So, number two, they're talking about ICE being around polling locations and already how they're deploying ICE all over the country, including down here in Georgia and across the South. That's already chilling the 2026 elections. You don't have to put law officers in front of polling locations. By the way, you're not allowed to have federal law enforcement in front of agencies. There's actually specific federal law about this. The threat of it, the idea of it. So this concept that elections are free and fair in this country, they are being engineered to not be. What we have to do is understand that autocrats try to control who votes, how they vote, whose votes are counted. Political parties try to persuade you for their vote. We are not dealing with a normal political party here. We are dealing with an autocratic attempted takeover. That doesn't mean, for the most part, Americans' votes are safe and secure. But it does mean that we can't go around saying and promising how things are going to be. What we have to tell ourselves and our friends and family is it's our votes, hands off our votes. Right? We need to mobilize broadly and deeply like never before. We need to become poll workers. We need to vote. We need to vote like ever before. But that's insufficient. We need to make sure our votes get counted. We need to track those ballots all the way through. But my
So,
point here is this concept of free and fair elections has not been true in the South, and it's not
mm,
necessarily true in the future. That doesn't mean we need to question the results or we need to necessarily go down the path that they have. But what we have to understand is we are not dealing with any kind of normal apparatus. The way I think Wendy articulated it beautifully, the compendium of things they are already doing already will have an influence on the fall. The question is what we all do to
right.
fight using every tool at our disposal is what's critical in these moments, and not to give up on any one institution. Don't give up on the courts, use the courts. Don't give up on organizing, use organizing. Don't give up on state lobbying and federal lobbying, use lobbying. Don't give up on using media and earned media. We have to use all of that and more when they are so seriously trying to engineer an outcome this fall to fully dispirit us from moving forward.
The point that Lauren first made, that they are already interfering in the election, is really critical. We should not be waiting for the next shoe to drop. Many of us are sitting out and gaming out what the next actions are and getting ahead of it, but you don't need to wait for that next action to understand that the time for our action is now, because this has been going on and it has escalated. And these actions, every single one of these actions is already undermining elections, diverting resources, dispiriting people, and actually interfering in all of how our elections are being conducted. And, and there are many more actions, I will say, that has happened over the course of
So,
the year. And, like in the courts step in, there's last year, the president issued a broad executive order purporting to rewrite election laws, purporting to require what the SAVE Act is now. We'll get into the SAVE Act soon, but like that would to require show me your papers, passport, or birth certificate to vote. Eventually, the courts have stepped in, and now three courts have found this unconstitutional. The president doesn't have this authority, but the amount of the amount of disruption this has caused in election offices around the country, in federal agencies that provide assistance to election administration, and the amount of fuel this has led to efforts by the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security to also take those as marching orders to take steps to interfere in elections has been legion. So there's a lot of election interference already underway, and we need to mobilize now.
you mentioned, Wendy, you mentioned the courts. So what is the role that government can play, that the courts can play, that Congress can play, that it needs to continue to play? Certainly, you mentioned in light of potentially passing the SAVE Act, in light of what decision we don't, whatever the decision is in Louisiana versus Calais, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'd love your thoughts on what is the role. I mean, we're talking about, we know that there's two things here. We need what citizens need to be doing, but what is our government need to be doing?
So I like the way Lauren put it, that, we have many, many different institutions and sectors of society that need to mobilize in favor of free and fair elections. The courts play a critical role. They have already, as I mentioned, this broad and executive order. The federal courts have pushed back, have all found it unlawful. This effort to try to gather up all of the sensitive voter file information from the voter rolls across the country that the states are charged with securing and maintaining. The courts have, so far, two federal courts have issued very scathing rebukes against the administration, saying you are not entitled to this sensitive information. The courts are a critical backstop in reaffirming what the law is, and in stepping in and trying to lay down the law and stop the administration from taking these unlawful actions. The courts are going to step in some form or another in Fulton County. There's been an order to unseal the affidavit and explain the basis for what's going on there. There might be some order there's been an effort to try to get the private information returned to Fulton County. Like, so the courts are in all of these efforts, the courts are going to play a critical role. That is not enough. And we've seen this in the immigration context elsewhere. State and local officials are going to play a critical role. across the country, they are preparing, and they are preparing as they always do for every eventuality and every kind of threat that might befall elections. In this case, now they have to prepare for threats from the federal government from inside, which is something that they've never had to do before. They too are going to play an important role to make sure that voters are protected, except in some places where they might not be doing that. But all of these efforts to by these institutions to protect our rights are not enough if we don't stand behind them. And this is what we are learning in the face of a real breach in trust with our government and autocratic push. The populace, all of us need to stand up for free and fair elections and for the rule of law, stand behind those judges issuing those rulings, stand behind those election officials that are refusing to turn over the sensitive voter information and protecting the privacy laws and election laws in their states. And we need to stand behind all of those community groups who are going to help people vote free from fear and free from fear from being rounded up. Like this is incumbent on all of us in this time.
Melissa, can I touch on like getting real, like real granular? Like I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat about
Please.
what it
Yeah,
means.
and we're going to try and get to a lot of those questions. Please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but what it means to stand behind at this moment. I don't care if you're in Oregon. I saw somebody said they're in Oregon. If you're in New York City, I saw somebody in Mississippi.
Laura.
Doesn't matter where you are. The voter suppression election denial movement has election administrators and activists in pretty much every corner of the country. They have 23 active chapters in 23 states and a goal to expand to all 50 this year. And we believe they're making pretty significant headway. And they have relationship ties with election administrators at the local level in pretty much every state. So if you are on a Zoom and you're like, I have time and I want to do more, standing behind your elections officials means literally going to the monthly meeting for your county or parish in Louisiana or your locality, depending on where you are and how they run elections. Literally go, make it your business for you and your friends to figure out what time that meeting is, where it is, and go. And stand up and give public comment if there's an opportunity to chime in about early voting access or a pro-voter issue that is raised, or just stand up and say, I want to thank you for serving as our elections officials in this county. What can we do? I will tell you, if you have not done that and you go and find a date to do that, they usually are monthly meetings. You are going to be so filled. Folks are going to be so grateful that you did it, and you will learn very quickly how mobilized the voter suppression apparatus is in your county. And trust me, doesn't matter what state you are, and they're there. So that's one example of what it means, because then you will know if there's a poll worker shortage coming up. You will know that you can then go, if you're retired, go get your retired friends to become poll workers in the fall. That's actually a paid job. And all of that is very doable and it needs to be done now. I'll give you one final example why now is so important. It's late winter and spring when many of these localities are figuring out their elections budgets for the fall. They're making decisions on where early vote locations are going to be. Are they going to be able to staff them? Are they going to have enough? Are they worried about X, Y, and Z? Those are decisions made now. And maybe you can help them find a location. Maybe you can be a really helpful citizen. Maybe you can speak up for that. So this first half of the year is crucial because it will set the budgets and the situation for all the localities who actually run the elections, unlike Mr. Trump, for next year. So that's what it means when we say standing up for elections officials.
Yeah.
Because guys, they, just like anybody has a trade association, you can believe that the trade association for local elections officials, the trade association for national secretaries of state, they were just actually in Washington. You can believe those networks are abuzz with just what happened in Fulton and all the rumors about what's going to happen next in Fulton that are flying through. So this is just so, I cannot say it enough, because part of what the regime is trying to do is not just chill or control participation in who counts vis-a-vis the SAVE Act, vis-a-vis getting voter rolls so that they can try to interfere in who they believe is eligible or not. It's about chilling election administration. And do you know why? Because that causes short staffing and long lines. Dr. Carol Anderson, one of the leading historians in our country on voter suppression and the history of it, will tell you that long lines are one of the most insidious, important ways to suppress the vote if that is your goal, because it functions like a poll tax. And so that is where they're trying to go. Why are they trying to eliminate vote by mail? Why are they trying to eliminate early vote? Because they're trying to get to lines. They're trying to get to a situation where fewer people are able to vote and voting takes longer. Why documentary proof of citizenship? Not just for registering, but for voting. They're trying to create bottlenecks and decrease turnout and decrease participation. And there's many resources about all of these things over the years. There's been a lot of analysis on this, but that's why poll workers and
So,
election administration may be one of the biggest issues that we're collectively faced with in the fall as these situations escalate.
so you're feeling alarmed, you're feeling powerless. Go to your local election officials,
Yep.
find out
Every
how you
single,
can volunteer, how you can be a poll worker, how you can volunteer with them. That's what's needed. And
uh,
helps them get a lay of the land, you're saying, of what's
exactly.
available to them.
And
Yep.
sometimes if there's a fraught issue in your community where you're seeing a lot of election denier, voter suppression, mobilization, just your physical presence being there and being supportive and not yelling and being obnoxious in the meeting and being supportive, that in and of itself can be enough. Because think about all the fights in our country. Being in solidarity with folks, the citizens who run our elections, I think is going to be incredibly important. Then take the next step. Talk to your business where you work. Talk to a lot of businesses used to give people off or give people time to be poll workers, used to encourage people to register and turn out. That's been chilled very
Yeah.
largely
All,
since
all of it has, it
2020.
sounds
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
So now take that information to your boss, to your company, to your organization. This is all extremely nonpartisan democracy work that every nonprofit, every corporation should be invested in no matter what the issue, because elections are the bedrock of obviously of our country. And we gotta get through this one, and it's gonna take all
Yeah.
hands on deck.
I want to pivot, and I'm looking at the time because I do want to get to some of these amazing questions. I'd love to pivot and talk about, as I keep mentioning, we are expecting Louisiana versus Cali, a decision from the Supreme Court in the potentially next month. Really potential to gut the Voting Rights Act, which obviously adds to what's going on here. Wendy, maybe if you want to, I want to ask both of you about this. I want to get into the details of the case, and I want to get into how this actually affects how government is able to back up all of the things we're talking about here.
So we are awaiting anxiously a decision in this case that has the potential to really upend what remains of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. The case involves whether or not you can draw political districts, redistricting based on race in a discriminatory way, and whether or not you can do that for partisan gain or not. And the Supreme Court has signaled that it might be poised to issue a really, significantly negative ruling that could gut a lot of what remains of the Voting Rights Act. And, we are, and I think that it's important for people to know that the Supreme Court has already significantly gutted this landmark law. This will be the third decision. First, it gutted back in 2013, its core, most powerful provision that helped to target jurisdictions with a history of discrimination. Just a couple of years ago, it issued a ruling making it very hard for people to challenge vote suppression laws that actually discriminate on the basis of race. And in fact, there's been not one favorable Supreme Court decision under the Voting Rights Act, despite the huge surge in vote suppression laws. And now there's a real risk to what the ability to use the redistricting process to go after and target and communities of color and on the basis of race. And I want to just put out there that if this in fact happens, and if the Supreme Court does this, will be a watershed moment, should be something that people get really, really angry about. We need to organize to respond, but I do think that the momentousness of what has happened, ought to be something that we all get up and and need to get out and decry. I mean, the Supreme Court gutting what would be the signature achievement of the civil rights movement, what actually has been substantially responsible for really moving us into a out of Jim Crow into a more functioning multiracial democracy, should be something that everybody is mad
Everybody.
about and that we all need to get up. And immediately, both leading up to that and after that, there's going to be a lot of work to do in many, many communities across the country. I'm going to pass the baton to Lauren, who's going to talk about this, but there is already work that is happening around the country in anticipation of this ruling by people who want to take advantage of what might happen to target representation in community, fair representation, and dismantle gains that have been made by communities of color in representation. And so, in addition to making your voice heard and standing up for the Voting Rights Act and actually decrying the Supreme Court and what has become of the Supreme Court, we need to get to work in communities across the country to not let this to turn into segregation of our political system. And I'll pass that to Lauren to talk about what's coming.
Please.
Yeah. So one thing to remind everybody of, number one, in 1963, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, there were only 4 Black members of Congress. In 2023, there were 64. About 60% of Black Americans live in the South. So those, one set of facts. Another fact to keep in mind is that 2021 was the year the most suppressive state voter bills were passed in our nation's history, exceeded only by 2022. I am citing the Brennan Center right now. And
This year is just as bad.
Yeah, and we are gearing up for a similar year. So a lot of the state legislative bills passed in 21 and 22 have been shown to have disparate racial impact on Black voters and other voters of color. You cannot talk about the larger architecture of voter suppression and this autocratic takeover without talking about the racial targeting and racial focus of these efforts, because that's ultimately what it is doing, trying to break our multiracial democracy, which is in line with what we see across this regime in terms of it's anti-immigrant, anti-DEI, anti-women, et cetera, sort of path here. So as we look at what could happen here on the Calais decision out of the court, we know the majority Federalist Society wing of the court. We know from their rehearing comments, it was a rehearing on October 15th of last year. We know they all dislike Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which mandates that if there is racially disparate voting, that racial minorities have an opportunity to have representation. That's the baseline of the law. You don't have to show intent to discriminate. You just have to show that people should have representation. And they all dislike it for different reasons. So we are expecting a ruling at the best to weaken it, at the worst of full gutting. And that could look a lot of different ways. So there's 2 things we're preparing for across the South. First of all, we co-released a report with Black Voters Matter to look at the impact. Look at the impact. What does the gutting of Black political power in the South do? That was the purpose of this law. And it also protects Native Americans and Latinos and others. But the core of this law is about Black voter representation, which is in the South. Our analysis shows that if they gut the Voting Rights Act and Southern states are able to redraw, they could take up to 19 seats for Republicans, locking one-party rule of Congress. We did a similar report on the state legislature and what they could do if the VRA was no longer in pact. It's 191 seats they could redraw as MAGA Republican seats in the South, moving themselves into majorities and supermajorities across the South. Now, all of this is caveated with, in terms of the partisan angle of it, is it a wave year? What does that look like? There's a lot of different question marks there. The point is, racial gerrymandering and gutting Black political power in the South is a very expedient way for MAGA to achieve its political goals for one-party rule at this time. So we were preparing for 2 things. Number one, educating people, prepping legislators, prepping local leaders, working to build local plans around this, because every state How do we draw lines in the South? We're not like states that have a redistricting commission. It's a simple state legislative procedure. Simple majorities in your House and Senate at the state level signed by the governor is basically how we do it in the South. So it's no supermajorities, no, redistricting commissions. Very partisan is how this goes down. So that's what it looks like, which means every state needs to be ready for different things. Every state has different politics and plans. But overall, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is going to be centered on a conversation in the South, but it's not just a Southern conversation. There are likely VRA protected districts in blue states all over the country. This is going to open up a much bigger conversation about what does fair representation, minority representation look like in a post VRA era. And so you're starting to see already states in the South and other states passing state voting rights act or introducing or reintroducing them. That's part of thinking about what comes next and starting to organize. So all of those things need to happen simultaneously because the decision could come any day because it was a rehearing. So I'll go pass it back to you on this thought, Melissa. The last sort of big political case decision that was a rehearing was Citizens United. It was a rehearing in the fall from a previous session of the court. That ruling came out on January 10th of the on political year. So that is why we're already at a fever pitch of organizing and prepping and all kinds of work, not just in the South, but everywhere, because we expect a decision could come any day now.
Well, first of all, thank you, because clearly we're going to need that work and we're going to need to get organized, or not just get organized, get moving right away. But assuming that this happens and assuming that the work that you are doing, that Brennan Center is doing, and that all of the people who are on our call and all of the wonderful activists around the country are doing what they need to do, and there is a sweep, there is a blue wave, and we do have elections that show that there's going to be change. I'm going to pivot to some questions that we have from our audience. And one is, how do we prepare for potential challenges to election results or peaceful transfers of power? We're talking about 2026. If everything they're trying to do doesn't work.
I will start with the answer is no different than what we need to be doing now. Again,
Okay.
what we need to be doing is stand up for free and fair elections, stand behind election officials, stand behind voters, stand up for the rule of law and for the courts that are doing the right thing, push back on any autocratic attempts to seize control of or centralize that process. Again, it is not proper. Resist the disinformation, document what's happening, and that's the same thing. We have strength in the system. The law is on our side, but this is a full-on mobilization both before the election, during the election, and after the election. And we already learned that starting in 2020, that protecting free and fair elections does not stop on election day. The attempts to attack elections continue after election day. And what we need to do is consistent across that. Now, the legal claims might change, the actions that election officials do might change, like some of the organizing might change, but for all of you out there, it's the same action. The other thing I want to say is that there is an opportunity, and there hopefully will be an opportunity to stop this kind of shenanigans in the future. And I just and as we get there, is that we need to have stronger protections in place so that these kinds of abuses can't happen. We need stronger oversight and stronger legal protections and infrastructure to prevent this kind of meddling going forward. We can talk about what that needs to be, but there's going to be an important role for Congress, especially a Congress that wants to protect free and fair elections, prevent our democracy from being taken over, not a crash.
I mean, that's kind of what's at stake in this election.
Yeah, they are going to need to step up and pass reform and make sure that the system is strengthened. Now that there's been this systematic and now pretty long-standing and escalating effort to weaken the system, we need to shore up that backbone, and we can't shirk from that responsibility in the future. But yes.
Well, it keeps reverberating, and you said this before we went on the air, and now the law is on our side, but we need to uphold it, period. And that I think we just need to keep that in our heads. I've got a great question here. Could a federal administration delay or suspend a national election under emergency powers? And what safeguards could prevent that? I don't know which
Yeah.
one of you wants to take that.
I'll
Wendy
take
will
that
take
one
that
quickly.
one.
That's the answer is no. There is
Okay,
so the election day is
good.
set by federal statute. Again, as I mentioned, the president has no role. The president has a lot of emergency powers that the president should not have, but none of them, not one of them, relate to elections. Not one of them give any authorization to meddle in elections in any way. So to the extent that that idea is being floated or threats are being made, they're legally without even the slightest basis.
And Melissa, just to go back one thing to give an example for folks on what they can do and what they should plan for. I think this group probably already knows this, but if you have vacation time that you're planning to like take off to volunteer around the election, make sure you save some for the post-election for your state
It's a
or
really
for
good point.
traveling to a neighboring state. Something you can do right now is look at your state certification dates because often the period between the election and certification dates are when there are issues and volunteers are needed for a whole variety of things in your state and in states around the country. So if you're retired, don't go on that cruise that time or don't go, on a golf trip to keep that time open after the election for your volunteering because that becomes really crucial. And especially if you can travel, sometimes that looks like chasing down voters to show their ID to make sure their ballots get counted, right? Sometimes it looks like dialing through voters to make sure they understand some sort of post-election issue. There's huge volunteer needs after election. Our whole calendar has changed since Trump came onto the scene because there's so many more contested elections. And so think about GOTV as starting at the beginning of the mail balloting period. So it depends on your state when that might be. If you have no fault vote by mail, look at the early vote dates. Think about GOTV starting once you can start requesting ballots all the way through to pass certification. That whole period is GOTV because we expect that we're going to need to fight to get people's votes counted afterwards as well. So that is
So
one way you
GOTV
can all
means
think about it.
counting the votes as well as placing them.
Correct.
It's like a change of reference there. Yeah, that's
Correct.
great. Um, I've got a question here, and we haven't really touched on this. This is from someone that says, in Virginia, our state legislature has bills to ban National Guard near election sites. Will that hold up in court? Two bills would give the governor notice when National Guard from other states are being sent out, and when their National Guard is being sent out by the president. Are there bills that can block? Are these bills that can block the federal overreach?
Yeah, so I want to start with people should know that it is already against federal law for there to be any, well, certainly any military near any deployed anywhere near elections and any armed federal troops and anywhere where, and that includes ICE, that would include National Guard if they're federalized, that would include like that is already a federal crime and violates a series of federal laws. It is also a federal crime to intimidate voters. So there's already a lot of federal law that makes that illegal. There are also now increasing state laws, like the one in Virginia, that state bill that would ban any kind of guns in or around polling locations or any other place where elections are being conducted or votes are being counted, as well as other laws that would reinforce what federal law already requires. And I think that I think that these are good efforts. I think that states are flexing to protect their own election infrastructure. The Constitution does give states the authority to run elections, and this is within their bailiwick. And so I think that there is a real reason to um, reinforce these bills. This is a federalism issue, and unless
Yeah,
Congress overrides those state laws, they govern.
they should
And
hold.
so, and they should hold. And again, they are reinforced by federal laws. I did want to also say one of the other reasons to speak up, this is both on this and on everything else. It's not just to stand behind courts and election officials or members of Congress who have done the right thing. It is also shoring them up so they feel comfortable doing the right thing. There is a relentless pressure campaign and by the administration that is and fear campaign that's trying to get people to do the wrong thing, to frighten them or threaten them into doing the wrong thing. And if we speak up in favor of the right thing, we've already seen cracks. We've seen Republican members of Congress, or say that no, the president, the administration does not have the authority to nationalize elections. We've seen the administration pull back the immigration troops from Minnesota.
Right.
So, like, this actually does have an impact too in shoring up officials and doing the right thing. And so, as you're thinking about also the post-election period as well, as well as any effort to try to threaten to send unlawful troops in or around elections, the more people speak up, the more people say that this is a line and this is unacceptable to me, the less likely it is to happen. And the more other public officials are going to use their platforms to push back, and they'll feel bolstered by that public opinion.
It makes sense,
Yeah.
right? Pushing back in the other direction. Is anybody, and I don't know if Brennan Center is doing this, is anybody challenging the post office change of postmark date that I guess went into effect in, was it January of 2025? December 2025.
Yeah. So I am not aware of any challenges to that, but my understanding is that change of postmark date is actually just codifying the practices in most jurisdictions. And I think that there are ways, there are workarounds that in states that have been put into effect to actually to provide people with the correct instructions, but it's not actually, my understanding is in most places, this is not going to change practices. And so of the long list of things to worry about, that postmark date, I would sort of lower it um, uh, on your worry list, though, there clearly gonna still be future attempts to try to meddle in the
Yeah.
postal service, and we should stand firm there. But this one is one that we can, I think is under control right now.
A number of people are asking about red states like Florida, where they already have the cooperation of the governor and have submitted voter information per the president's request. What, if anything, can be done about that?
Well, I want to talk about sort of that from a different angle and let Wendy talk about the legal side of that. So
Okay.
I think something folks need to understand is that all of this different kinds of intimidation and meddling also has an unintended consequence. What we have seen in Georgia and we saw last year in Mississippi, I saw last year actually in Louisiana, is that the more it is known and naked and plain what they are doing, the more people are willing to act differently and step up. Number one, there is a real risk to people's health and welfare from protesting in Minnesota, right? Two American citizens were shot
Yes.
dead on the street. We've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of Minnesotans come out and protect their neighbors. That's a really bold and extreme example that when it is clear that there's this massive overreach, American residents are not going to take it. What we saw in Georgia in 2020, the root of all of this conspiracy that led to the raid, we had Alex Jones marching around with militia members, our state capitol in, November, December of 2020. We saw really extreme, harmful kinds of voter suppression. Then you know what we also saw? We saw historic voter turnout in the 2021 runoffs. Last year, voters went in record numbers to the polls in Louisiana to reject a bunch of constitutional amendments from baby Trump Landry. Last year, Mississippians went to the ballot in the fall in record numbers to break Republican supermajorities in the state House and state Senate. So we can't
Yeah.
stop everything they are doing, and the courts, as well as other folks, capitulate too often, and the laws are not always in our favor anymore. I mean, there's other new bills other new rulings from the Supreme Court this session that have been very harmful. But the reality is, the more it is naked and plain, the more I think Americans understand what's at stake. And that's the area that we need to focus on in terms of turnout.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see that in Florida and Georgia and elsewhere. And then as they grab the voter files, what they're going to try to do, we believe, I don't know what they're going to try to do, but why do they want those voter files so badly? Well, they're getting partisan data on folks. They're getting personal information so that they can come up with lists of people they can try to kick their ballots out. I assume,
Right.
try to challenge
Right.
those votes or try to kick people
But
out. So that's where we're going to need to be ready to fight in that post-election period in particular.
Yeah.
and to your point, that just knowing about that, being out there that's really that upsets people. And there are
It
more of us
does.
than there are of them. And that upsets
It
people that they
does.
thought it might not upset.
Well, and
So
and Americans are stubborn and take their rights for granted. But when you start saying that right you take for granted, we're going to
yes.
take away because it gives you too much power. There's actually a bunch of research on this at this point that people are like, what? No. And
Yeah.
so voter suppression is real. It is going to impact people who are vulnerable and people who are struggling to make ends meet because these are poll taxes. So it is real, real, real and has a real impact. At the same time, their intentions are plain and people will push back hard. The level of
And that's what we've
turnout
got
we
to
are
do.
seeing in elections over
Yeah.
the past
Yeah.
year is extraordinary. And so I think the thing we all know that Trump and his people are not just theoretical on this now. And it doesn't matter your political persuasion. If you are not in the conspiracy theory, if you're an independent, a moderate, a partisan or not, you understand that they're trying to shut down democracy and shut
Yeah.
down a two-party system. It's plain. I mean, when Trump says he thinks Republicans should run elections, that is beyond anything we've ever seen before, but makes it very plain that it's
Yeah.
time to use our democracy like never before.
And I just wanted to add two things to that. So one is this is not only going to impact Democrats, this is going to impact Republicans.
Everybody. Yep.
This is, and the private information that has been turned over in those 10 states that, or plus, that have done so. It's, that's everybody's information that has now been centralized and that's available. And that we have no idea. There's a lot of reason to suspect that it is not being maintained in a secure way. And the administration does not have a good track record and they haven't gone through any of those privacy steps. And I do think people in those states can also make their dissatisfaction known to their state officials. I mean, those state officials also are democratically accountable. And what the heck? I
Right.
entrusted you with all of my
Mm.
private data and information, and you went ahead and turned it over. That is against your legal duty. And in a way that is not protecting my rights, my interest, and the oath that you swore. So I do think, and there's things that people can do there too. There's a lot of legal things that people can do, but I think that to the extent that people are speaking up in those jurisdictions, they should be hearing from you as well. Not just the folks that are doing the right thing. Thank you for doing the right thing, but the people who are doing the wrong thing should understand
Right.
that, that folks are really upset about that and they're going to hold them accountable.
I'm looking at the time. We only have a couple of minutes left. I know a lot of people have expressed concern about the operating systems of voting machines and the integrity there. I don't know whether you guys want to speak briefly about that, but I want to get to a question that we ask many of our guests, and which hopefully will leave us energized for the fight ahead, which is what is giving you hope at this time? I mean, listening to you, and I really am so thankful that you have given us so many concrete actions that individuals and grassroots groups can be taking, but that's giving me hope. But what is giving you hope right now?
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
Wendy, go ahead.
Go ahead, Wendy.
I wanted to start first with, before what's giving me hope, just one other concrete action that
Oh, great.
listeners can take is that unrelated or aligned with, but separate from this administration's effort to try to seize control of elections. There is a vote that's going to take place in the House of Representatives this week on a vote suppression bill called the SAVE Act. And there are many different versions of it, but essentially it is a show me your papers bill that would require people to show a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. That is something that would block millions of Americans from being able to register and vote. There are 21 million eligible Americans that don't have ready access to those documents. 50% of
Yeah.
us don't even have a passport. Many, many more have no clue where their birth certificate is. This is a vote suppression bill. That is really important. And people need to step up and say no to this legislation. And that is
And we've got we've got links to 5 calls to call your senator or your and let people know what they think and why this is terrible. So thanks for bringing that up.
yeah. And so I just wanted to make sure that got in. Happy to talk more
Thank
about
you.
that in a
Thank you.
different call.
Yes,
But
it'll have to be different. We have 2 minutes, so
yeah,
very quickly.
very quick. What's
Hope.
been one of the things that is giving me hope are, well, so I started with all this stuff is illegal. All of the courts that are looking at this are agreeing that it's
Mm,
illegal. Election officials are standing up also and saying this is illegal and taking lots of steps to protect elections. Folks like Fair Fight and Brennan Center and many other groups have come together also to support elections. What is going on in Minnesota and everywhere else around the
mm.
country, where the American public is getting up to also stand up for the Constitution, what is right, gives me hope that that can be that kind of energy can be harnessed to protect our elections as well. And this Zoom is one more example of that. And Lauren.
It sure is. It sure is. Lauren,
Well,
what's
this
giving you
great
hope?
community here, it gives me a lot of hope, all the engagement. And obviously, we are in a really tough national spotlight. I'm sitting here literally in Fulton County, and I will tell you, we have county commissioners in Fulton County who are stepping up big time. They understand
Mm.
the larger implications of this. They are fighting, and the local leadership is incredible to see. And I think that just goes overall. We have incredible state legislators. We have incredible local elected officials all over the South who are really doing not just defending their constituents and their states, they're really speaking up for democracy nationally as the South has become such a crucible of all of these issues. So that is gives me hope. Literally, I'm going to go see some of them this afternoon, and that will re-energize me for the fight to make
You
all these
you seem pretty
connections.
energized. You both do. I can't
Well,
I can't
I'm
thank
with Wendy. Fills me with energy.
and
Thank
you
you.
guys, you thank you both so very much for coming, for joining us, coming back to Big Tent,
Of
and for
course.
all of your work to protect our elections. This has been a great hour, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope that you'll follow us on social media and on Substack, and come back again soon. And have a great rest of the day. And speak up, speak out, fight back. Thank you all.
Bye.